just go ahead and get into talking about the latest episode of the Disney Gallery Star Wars show about the Mandalorian. And this one was all about practical effects, which I think it was actually titled Practical, correct?
Yes, that is correct. It was pretty practical, right?
Pretty practical. So we'll start off just talking about general overall impressions. I found this episode to be very, very interesting. I was surprised at some of the things that, kind of like Nine Numb from the original movies from Return of the Jedi. I didn't realize that was actually like. Now I'm about to say something I know it's not incorrect. Eric, do you remember what wasn't Nine Numb? Wasn't that was that a puppet or a dude in a suit?
It was both, I believe.
It was okay.
Similar. That was kind of similar to what they did with Quill.
That's what I was going to say. I was surprised.
Same with Akbar, I believe. Akbar and was also done in a similar fashion, if I remember correctly.
I was just surprised to see that, because for some reason when they showed some of the behind the scenes stuff where he's on the back of the creature, I kept thinking he was probably just a puppet. So I was surprised that that it was a lady in a suit with an animatronic mask on. I was like, wow, that's really cool. And that was just one of the amazing things that we saw in this particular episode. This one and the last one, where they talked a lot about the crazy video wall that they kept referring to, the volume or whatever. These are the ones I was most curious about, because I wanted to see what they were really doing with the show and how they were crafting it, how they were creating it. There was a lot of really cool stuff they did actually with the child, or Baby Yoda, as some people may know him. It was really interesting to actually see the puppet and actually see them kind of doing stuff with it and seeing how that they would, kind of bring it to life, and actually getting a chance to see some of the people who actually work on the puppet, who actually do bring it to life. I found this episode to be really, really intriguing. And to be honest, I've been enjoying this series on Disney Plus overall. But I'd have to say this one and the last one are the two that I felt like I found the most interesting. They did spend a little bit of time talking about actually also doing some of the how they were shooting the Raven Crest, the ship, and then talking about that originally they were just going to have a couple of what do they call that? Where they've got the computer assisted, where they replicate the camera movements. I can't remember what it's called now. Motion control. They wanted to have a couple of shots, kind of old school, just to have in the show, so they could say that they'd shot the Raven Crest, the Mandalorian ship, kind of the same way that they did a lot of the classic Star Wars ships, where you're talking about the original A New Hope, and you're talking about, the Millennium Falcon. You're talking about, obviously the X-Wings and the TIE Fighters. And they wanted a shot that they could say, we shot this just like the others. And they did talk, too, that a lot of the research they were doing, and apparently it was one of the guys who worked on the effects for the film, he talked about how, as sort of, I guess, just a passion project or for fun, he had actually been collecting a lot of the actual motion-controlled, actual shots from the various films into some kind of a sample reel or something they could look at. And it caused him to actually go back and actually reference some of the original films and some of the war footage that George Lucas had used to cut together kind of like a temp to help the visual effects guys understand what the timing needed to be for how fast the X-Wings would move and how fast the TIE Fighters would move, and kind of a way to approach the space battle so that it felt grounded and real. And all that stuff was terribly, terribly interesting. So, but I definitely say this episode and the last episode, for me, are definitely the highlights so far, because I really enjoyed seeing all the cool stuff that they did. So my overall impression with this episode was this was a lot of fun. What did you think, Eric?
Well, what I really liked was how well the previous episode led into this one. The previous episode being technology. And as we've talked a lot about how fascinated we were about the entire video wall that they were using, the back screen technology that they were using. But what's really interesting is in the previous episode, they showed a little bit of how, even though they were using all this projection screen technology, that it also incorporated the camera, where basically the camera, as the camera moved, the background would change because they were incorporating video game technology with the camera, so that when the camera moves, the background moves appropriately and all that kind of stuff. And so it's kind of like, almost like a live green screen on steroids is one way you could look at it. But that's not exactly what they did. They also had a lot of practical effects. And of course, that's what this episode is all about. They had practical sets, real things for the actors to interact with. So it's very much a hybrid filming technique. And so in this episode, we got to see the other half of that. Like literally, for instance, they mentioned in the previous episode that the Mandalorian ship, only half of it actually exists in real life in terms of on the actual set. It actually goes all the way up to the roof, and then the roof actually is also a projection screen, and it fills up the rest of the ship. So but there is that part of the ship that's actually the set. And so it was interesting in this episode where they really kind of emphasized a lot of these practical effects that they've been using. In particular, they really emphasize the puppetry, which I'm a big fan of puppetry. I'm a big fan of the Muppets and things like that. Obviously, with Star Wars going back to Yoda, the original Yoda, and Empire Strikes Back, operated by the legendary Frank Oz, who obviously was very much involved with Jim Henson and the Jim Henson Company. So kind of seeing them kind of get back to those roots was really, really interesting to me. Like, I didn't understand how Quill was done exactly. I just kind of assumed that it was a man of small stature in a suit, and that I kind of wondered how the mouth movement and everything worked. I kind of almost assumed that they were using a lot of CGI, and that was not the case. It was fascinating to me to see that this is a person in a suit, but the face is essentially a puppet in and of itself that other people are operating. And it was interesting to see the actor, the person that's actually in the suit, who is a female, basically talking about incorporating all that. And then, of course, on top of that, it's Nick Nolte's voice. So there's even that element of it as well. But they're basically, she was mentioning how she had to do things like give little hand signals to help with like the dialogue and everything, because basically somebody else is operating her mouth while she's trying to act. And I find that fascinating because, so often in Hollywood and in the filmmaking process in general, there's this very dismissive attitude of the person in the suit. You see that a lot with Hollywood actors and their egos and things like that. It's like, oh, well, that's just the person in the suit, who cares? And in this particular instance, you could really see, well, this is why you should care, because to me, it's just amazing that they're able to do that, because you have somebody completely different, basically, that's not in the camera frame at all, that's off to the side, wherever they are, controlling the mechanisms in the face. And you have an actor in the suit that's having to kind of act with the actors, live within the studio, but they're not able to control the mechanism of even their own mouth. It's fascinating to me. It's just amazing to me that they're able to incorporate all those things together and get something that looks so seamless to me. That ends up looking so good. And I found that just really, really, really interesting, because I didn't realize that that's what they did. I didn't realize that was literally a prosthetic with an animatronic inside that was fully functioning and could actually move, and the lips could move, the mouth could move, the eyes could move, and all that kind of stuff. And it wasn't the actor that was operating that stuff. It's these people basically off to the side that are doing the puppetry. I found that really, really fascinating. I was actually really surprised about that. Again, I do think that they use a similar technique with Akbar. I'm not 100% on that, but I believe that there was a similar process, because I remember watching some of those behind the scenes films regarding the Return of the Jedi and the original Star Wars trilogy. And as I recall, that's Akbar was, in some scenes he would be a guy in a suit, and then other scenes it was a puppet. You know what I mean? That they basically operated so that they could get all those different, unique movements and everything like that with the eyes and the mouth and all that kind of stuff. And then, of course, in wider scenes, it would be a guy in a suit, and they would kind of go back and forth. In this case with Quill, it's all incorporated there. The face, is actually still animatronic. And again, to me, that just blows me away, because to me, it seems like the timing and everything, everybody has to be so in sync to make that work, especially while there's a director, in the studio actually directing the other live actors and telling them what to do in real time, and they're having to film all that. I just found that incredibly fascinating and didn't realize that was even possible, because that takes an immense amount of coordination when you really think about it.
Yeah, I found it really, really, really cool, and I really enjoyed getting to see all of that. And I was very stunned to find out that Quill, the man in the suit, turned out to be a wool man in the suit for Quill. It was really interesting, and I've always been curious about a lot of that process and how they do a lot of that. And I'd love to one day be involved with something where they do all that kind of stuff. I think that'd be kind of fun. You know what I mean? To see a character brought to life like that. And it's interesting too, because I have a lot of hope. I'm going to talk about independent film here for just a half a second. I have a lot of hope for all the amazing things that hopefully independent filmmakers will be able to do soon. Hopefully kind of seeing the way, for example, if you're an independent filmmaker, I think this is interesting to see what they're doing and how they're using technology with The Mandalorian in this particular series. Not because you're going to have the resources to do the exact same thing, but it might spark an idea, or it might lead you down a different path. I mean, we can't do that, but we could do something like this. It'd be interesting. What it brings to mind is I'm a member of the Disney film, The Black Hole. Is a fascination of mine. I've loved that film since I was a kid. And there was a gentleman who actually just finished, I think he just finished, or he's almost finished, actually building a Vincent, an actual 1-to-1 scale Vincent prop.
That's cool.
And he's been 3D printing some of it, building components of some of it, and kind of slowly cobbling it and putting it together. And watching all their stuff they're doing with the animatronics and stuff, I was like, wow, it'd be cool. You could have a robot like that on set and maybe actually make it work. And I just find all this stuff really, really interesting. So I really, really enjoyed this particular episode. I thought it was really cool. Is there anything else?
Well, one of the interesting things you kind of touched on, you were talking about with independent filmmakers and things that they might be able to take away from this, which I think there's a lot you could actually take away from it. But there was one thing that I found really interesting, which is that they talked about the fact that they actually did make a miniature of the Mandalorian ship, but it was almost hardly used. It was really made more than anything for Favreau and Filoni to kind of geek out. They wanted to geek out a little bit and have something practical. And they said they justified it in the budget by saying that they needed it for to show the lighting, so they get the lighting right and things like that. And they said they ended up actually using it for a couple of shots in the television show, because primarily it's CGI. That particular ship is CGI within the actual within the show. But there are several shots where they did use the miniature, and they had the visual effects person as part of the round table who built it and had the expertise to do that. And he mentioned how it had been a while since he'd actually built a miniature, because they're way more expensive than the CGI, which I found really interesting. It's like, so that's why you don't see miniatures as much anymore, apparently, is because they're actually much more expensive to construct than to just do it in CGI. So it's kind of becoming, he kind of implied it's becoming kind of a dying art form. This is something that he knows how to do because he's been in the industry for a long time. But he hasn't done it in a while. And so it was kind of fun for him to actually make one. And like I said, it was very obvious that, Favreau kind of had this done because he just kind of wanted one. You know what I mean? Like, he even said, like, he kind of implied that he takes pieces of the set and he gets to take a lot of this stuff. You know what I mean? Because he's the showrunner, he's the director. it has to go somewhere. You know what I mean? And they don't really put stuff in the vault anymore. So he was basically kind of implying that he plans to take it home. You know what I mean? That's the whole reason they had the thing made in the first place. But I found it really interesting that's apparently an issue now. Is that miniatures aren't being made as much anymore because they're just not cost effective, which I thought was really, really kind of interesting, and in some ways a little bit sad, because you wonder how long is it going to be before that particular craft is lost. You know what I mean? This guy knew how to do it because he's been in the business for a long time, and he learned from people in Lucasfilm how to do this kind of stuff. And he was the one that was doing the archive that you mentioned, where he was taking, and what he was doing was he was taking shots from the original trilogy, and he was cataloging them, specifically of the ships, and then he was remodeling them with CGI, and he was trying to do frame by frame, like frame by frame accurate representations of, like, say, a Star Destroyer, but in CGI, which I also thought was interesting. And then he was trying to see what he could do to push it and maybe make the CGI, quote unquote, better. And that got them into a really fascinating discussion where they talked about the sort of visual aesthetic of the original Star Wars films, and how much of that was deliberate and how much of that was just based on the technology they had at the time, and actually even like mistakes, what I mean, that were basically, it was just because they didn't have the money or they didn't have the technology. Like, for instance, they talked about the way that a lot of these starships were shot in the original trilogy. It was based on the size of the model, and it was based on the camera technology at the time. And certain shots simply could not be done because the model was too big and the camera could only go so far. And then eventually they had to make smaller models, but they couldn't do that in the first film because they didn't have the budget. And they really got into it, which I thought was really fascinating. I mentioned this before, that you really feel with Favre and Filoni that the rumors are very, very true, that these guys are absolutely like George Lucas loyalists. And they are like George Lucas fanatics. They are fans themselves. You can really tell that when you see this series, in particular in this episode, because they really get into it. And it's kind of funny. I've said this before, and I'm going to keep saying it. As long as she's there, Kathleen Kennedy looks so out of place and so awkward in those roundtable discussions when she's involved. When she's like involved, she doesn't contribute like anything. You know what I mean? When she's at the table, and it's just funny to see Favre and Filoni like just go back and forth about, yeah, George did this and George did that. You know what I mean? And we want to do it like this. We want to do. Well, they mentioned what it's Salacious Crumb, the little creature that's with Jabba the Hutt, that's laughing all the time, and of course he gets cooked, Mandalorian, or at least not him, right, but one of his species. And they got the guy that actually designed him and constructed him for Return of the Jedi and brought him back just to do that, which I think is, just shows you, their mentality and the loyalty that they have, that they brought him back, this person that actually worked on Return of the Jedi, just to do that, just to recreate that one. I mean, that scene is almost like a throwaway. That scene is like it's an Easter egg. You know what I mean? That's basically all that scene is. And the fact that they brought back the actual guy to recreate that particular puppet and operate that puppet and everything like that, to me is like, yeah, these guys are obviously fans. I mean, they really get it. They are definitely like old school George Lucas loyalists. And you can tell, I think that's in a lot of ways, even without knowing that, that's why the show has resonated so well with really like old school hardcore Star Wars fans, is because the guys running it really are old school hardcore Star Wars fans, and they really know their stuff. You touched on it too when we were talking about the ship, and this was also when they were talking about the miniature and some of that kind of stuff. They talked about how George Lucas was heavily influenced by the film The Battle of Britain, and in that film, The Battle of Britain, was filmed at a time where they weren't, they decided not to use miniatures, and they'd use real aerial footage. And I've kind of talked about this before too on previous episodes about how George Lucas based the fighter combat, like the attack on the Death Star, that is based on like World War II fighter pilots, and specifically Favreau and Filoni were talking about. He based it on this film, The Battle of Britain, that was all filmed, in the air with real planes. This was actual real aerial photography with, World War II vintage planes done, live, in the air. And that's what influenced George Lucas and the style that he made the combat. That's why it feels so authentic. And that's also why I would say the Disney Wars stuff, a lot of it feels so hollow, because I think a lot of the Disney War stuff, particularly in the trilogy, the Disney War trilogy, it feels very hollow because instead of it feeling like it's based on real combat, actual fighter combat, it's based on Star Wars. And it becomes like, just that one step removed, and it just becomes so much less believable. And it's just so interesting to see, because I didn't know that. I didn't know that specifically George Lucas based the combat on that movie, The Battle of Britain. And it just makes you realize, well, that's why it's so good. It's because back then they didn't have CGI, and they didn't use miniatures in this particular movie. They used real vintage World War II fighter planes, and they filmed them in the air. And that's what he based this fictional space combat on. And that's why it's so good. That's why it's so good. That's why it's so authentic. That's why it still rings true today, because it's based on something that actually was, an actual reality, as opposed to just, silliness, where it's based on fictional stuff. And hey, Bobby, it's good to see you. He says, such a big difference when the creators are fans of the material. Cough, cough, Picard. Oh, yes, Bobby Picard. But, Kurtzman's a fan. He's a fan now, even though he's on record as saying he was never a Star Trek fan. He's a Star Wars fan, but now he's a fan.
Well, I think I've kind of said my piece on this episode. I really, really enjoyed it. And I did think that was interesting. Because I didn't think that, I was curious to see if they would talk about the ships in this particular episode, or if they would get further into that in another episode. So I did like all that stuff that they talked about it, and it was interesting too. I always like where they do that, where they do wax poetic and they talk about what they were doing in the original Star Wars films and what they were trying to achieve, or what they were looking at, or what they were inspired by. That's always very interesting to know. Because I'd always seen and known that Lucas had, actually used actual, dogfight footage, and cut that together in sort of like a temp, so that the effects guys would understand what they needed to do, in order to bring the effects shots across. But it was still a bit of a surprise to learn where it actually came from. So I thought that was really interesting. So. Very cool.
They're like Star Wars historians, because they weren't there, that's what I find fascinating as well. And Filoni, of course, talked about the institutional knowledge at Lucasfilm, which is immense, Industrial Light and Magic and everything like that, because even though not all the same people are obviously there, and obviously not all the same people are working on these projects, the institutional knowledge is there because the guys that are there, they learned from the guys that were doing, say, the prequels, you know what I mean? And then the prequel guys learned from the guys who did the original trilogy. And so there's incredible continuity at Lucasfilm, and you can see, Filoni, being someone who's been at Lucasfilm longer than Favreau, really talking about that, and kind of, you can just tell these guys really know the history of this entire process, and they really appreciate it, they really ingest it, and they really try to use it. One thing we didn't really talk about is the Baby Yoda. This is the episode that they really got into Baby Yoda, and wow, that puppet is amazing, absolutely amazing, and just seeing them talking about it and seeing the actors talking about it, and how cool it was for them, where they said that they almost felt, even on the set, like Baby Yoda was just stealing the show, because everybody was just like, they got so immersed into the puppet. You know what I mean? Like the puppet sort of became like a real person for them. There's some pretty funny stories about that, where they talk about the actor that played the Imperial officer, that he just got so invested into Baby Yoda, and was even like chastising the director and the crew and everything like that about, hey, you got to really get into this. You know what I mean? Like because he was saying, like, he wasn't talking to the puppeteers, he was talking to the puppet. You know what I mean? So he was really, which by the way also reminds me of what comes across with like the Muppets, because you see that with the Muppets. Obviously, when actors interact with the Muppets, they interact with Kermit. They don't interact with Jim Henson. You know what I mean? You can see that. You know what I mean? So that technique, I think, is very tried and true. You know what I mean? In a lot of ways, and it sells the scene so much more.
No, yeah, and I did find it was I thought it was very humorous there, telling that story about Werner Herzog and how he wanted them to commit to the
Yeah,
puppet, and
commit to the
getting
puppet.
very, yeah. So I wish they could show us. I wish someone had shot some behind the scenes footage, because I'd love to see him telling them, you have to commit to the puppet. Like, I would love to see that. I think they're pretty awesome.
That would be really funny, and it's
Yeah.
probably there, but I they definitely select. They kind of pick and choose what it is that they're going to put in there. You know what I mean? There is some polish, involved with this, because they show a lot of the finished scenes. You know what I mean? And I'm kind of like, I've seen the finished scenes. I really don't need to see that again. I would like to see, the process a little bit more. Like, they even
Yeah.
mentioned that they did some stop motion. They did some stop motion with the creatures from the battle for Endor, that they actually put in, the ones that they ride around on.
Right,
I wish I
right.
could remember what they're called, but those are actually from the Battle of Endor. They're actually from the one of the Ewok specials, and originally they were stop motion. So there's actually a shot that they did in stop motion, and they just talked about it. They didn't really show the process, but I was like fascinated by that they actually incorporated stop motion, which, like, today is like, unless it's like, Wallace and Gromit, it's like
Right.
dead. You know what I mean? It's like,
Yeah.
that's like the only place you see it. We have a comment from Anthony, YouTube fan. He says, "Hi guys, I have to say, seeing the ships of the Mandalorian be comprised of models, almost actual size, and CGI was the best of all worlds in Star Wars. Filoni and Favreau are the future." And Anthony, I hope you are correct. There's all sorts of rumors about a power struggle going on right now with Kennedy versus Favreau, about who's going to be in charge of Lucasfilm creatively. There's all sorts of rumors that, and you can see it in the body language. You can just so see it in the body language. Favreau sits right next to Filoni, and they're always talking to each other like they're best friends. And Kathleen Kennedy is just kind of off to the side, and there's a clear space between them. And Favreau very rarely looks at Kathleen Kennedy when she's talking. I mean, it's the body language is just there. And I'm surprised more people haven't commented on that, because I just see it like just so obvious that there's a chasm between the two of them, I think, creatively. That's the way I interpret it.
No, and I thoroughly enjoyed seeing all the practical stuff too. I just thought it was just amazing, and I would have to. I'm going to chime in and agree with what Anthony, YouTube fan, says, and I mean, I think that that's true. I do think that what Filoni and what Favreau are doing, is the future for Star Wars. What they've done with The Mandalorian is amazing, and it's captured the imagination of not just old school Star Wars fans, but even some of the new Star Wars fans. It's living in that place where it's doing, ideally, hopefully, what Star Wars would do, which is appealing to a large audience and just, a fun, really great adventure and escapism and just all those fun things you look forward to. At least I look forward to, like, specifically in science fiction. And it's I don't know, it's a lot of fun. I really am enjoying seeing how they're putting all the shows together, and I've enjoyed everything that they've done, talking with all the different ones. But I'd have to say this one and the last one are my two favorite because I'm a bit of a process junkie. Even though this doesn't directly apply, to comic book illustration, in the sense of a lot of the stuff that I do love seeing how they're putting all these things together and how they're taking and utilizing all these different techniques, to bring all the creatures and the characters, to life. I think it's really, really fascinating.
They did touch on the concept art for Baby Yoda a little bit. They did bring that in where they were talking about the different versions of Baby Yoda, as the process was going on, and they showed some of those images. And they talked about how they thought that some of them were like too cute, some of them were too ugly, and then they finally had this one design that basically is the basis of what we see on screen. And they said, okay, that's it. There's just something very endearing about that particular design. And they obviously made a fantastic choice because, Baby Yoda has stolen the show. Even people that don't really like the show still like Baby Yoda. Baby Yoda has become like a phenomenon. And I know there are detractors of Baby Yoda, but let's face it, you're in the very small minority if you're someone that doesn't like Baby Yoda. You know what I mean? In some ways, it kind of reminds me of Ewoks at the time that Ewoks actually came out. Not today, not with adults looking back. But when Ewoks first came out, they were universally beloved by the kids that saw that movie. I mean, Ewok fever was everywhere. I remember kids coming on the bus with their Ewoks and stuff like that. I mean, it was a huge phenomenon. That's why they had 2 TV movies for it. That's why they had a cartoon. You know what I mean? It was like a phenomenon. And Baby Yoda to me is very much like that. But what's interesting about Baby Yoda is it seems to me that adults love Baby Yoda as much as kids do. You know what I mean? Like there's so many adults that are into Baby Yoda.
No, it's all really interesting, and I do remember how much everybody loved the Ewoks back in the day too. I particularly enjoyed. I think of all the Ewok stuff they did, besides obviously them in Return of the Jedi, I think my favorite thing was actually the Ewoks cartoon. I remember watching and enjoying that cartoon quite a bit as a kid. I do remember. I think I liked it more than Droids. Droids to me always seemed to be like on the edge of being Star Wars because it just never brought those classic characters in enough that for me it ever really felt truly like Star Wars. It's weird because I remember when I watched Solo, I had that same weird disconnect that I had with the Droids cartoon. It's like I know this is supposed to be Star Wars, but it just doesn't click. But I always enjoyed the Ewoks cartoons. I really enjoyed those, from back in the day. And we have
I just wanted to say, growing up, I actually had my best friend was a big Droids fan, which I like Droids. In fact, I even own a copy of one of the DVDs for Droids. But I was always a bigger fan of the Ewoks cartoon than Droids. But I watched both of them. I liked both of them.
And I'd have to say I really like the intro song. It's very sort of 80s kitschy cartoon kind of thing, but I've always loved the intro song for Droids. That's the one thing. And there's that group where they dress up like Transformers that I think they're called Cybertron and Spree or something like that. I forget the exact name. They have a really interesting cover of that. It's crazy to see Transformers, singing the theme song from Droids. So it's pretty.
Which, by the way, on the DVD they don't have that because that particular song was made by the drummer from the Police, and so there's a rights issue. So they don't even have the song on the DVD, which is a real shame.
That's one of the best things. I really like that song. So, it'd be fun. I'd love to see someone take stuff from the Mandalorian and actually cut it to that song. I wonder if that might be fun. That'd be an interesting sort of thing.
That would be neat. That would be neat.
Yeah.
Any of you people that are good at editing and like to do your little fan edits, somebody needs to do that.
I did. It'd be fun.
Pretty cool.
So, because the hook is trouble again. I think it'd be fun. So yeah.
No, I can see it. I can actually see it in my head, Dave. I think that actually would be a lot of fun. That would be a lot of fun. Of course, you'll be hit with a copyright hit immediately once you do something like that.
Well,
It
that's
is what it
that's that's why you put it on Vimeo instead.
is.
Just don't
Well,
even bother putting it on
Peggy's
YouTube.
back, and Peggy says,
Hello.
I love the combo. It's so much more seamless than what Lucas did when he went back over and redid the original series. And by the way, they did kind of touch on that in the previous episode, the contrast of just using blue screen versus, using this projection screen has really opened things up for them quite a bit. And obviously that combination of practical along with the screen, like I said, it's almost like a live action blue screen, but they have a lot more practical effects going on than a traditional blue screen or green screen setup. And she also says, I've always loved the concept art that we are sometimes allowed to see. Just that type of art, it could fill volumes of books. And we talked about that when we were reviewing the Mandalorian episodes themselves, how much we enjoyed the concept art. And I'm wondering if that's going to be a bigger part of the next episode, because the next episode is entitled Visualization. So I'm wondering if that might be part of it. I'm thinking there's going to be more like they might talk about the CGI, possibly, but also I'm hoping, since it is called Visualization, that they might focus more on that beautiful concept art that you see at the end of the in the credits at the end of every single Mandalorian episode, because that stuff is awesome. I love that stuff.
Well, and the whole concept of visualization is, Eric, being versed in films, knows it's every concept that it's all those different, not concepts, not the right word. It's all the different steps and the processes that help you to craft, the design and the look and the vision. So I'm pretty sure the visualization we'll see some animatics. We're going to see just some straight up concept art. I think we're going to see character designs. They haven't really spent a lot of time, for example, really telling us about, what all they were specifically looking at when they were crafting the Mandalorian. We know there's some influence from the holiday special because the Mandalorian has like Boba Fett's little, tuning fork looking gun. So we know that they were
Favreau directly referenced the holiday special as like part of sort of like the inspiration for this show and the precedent for this show, because he was talking about specifically the holiday special and the Ewok movies as sort of being like where he's at, because he's basically on the peripherals, because he's not part of the big film, right? He's not part of one of the big films. So he's actually saying he's in the same category. He implied that basically, that he's part of that lineage and that heritage of the holiday special and the Ewok movies. And it's so funny to me because so many people today are very dismissive of all that, and he embraces it. He's like, that's the club I'm in. That's the realm that I'm in right now. You know what I mean? And he just fully embraces it, and he doesn't. There's no shame or anything like that. He's just rolling with it, and like you said, direct references. Like the Mandalorian's weapon. That's a direct reference to the holiday special and the weapon that Boba Fett had when he first appeared, and then also those creatures that are directly from the battle for Endor. You know what I mean? And they even use the stop motion for some of that, which is what they used originally when they created those creatures. So I think that's just, I think, like I said, the guy's obviously a fan. I mean, he's obviously just like a Star Wars nut. I mean, which is pretty cool.
And that's kind of what I am really kind of excited for, kind of moving forward, and specifically with this next episode. I want to see what specifically they were looking at for some of these characters and how they kind of, put the designs together. They showed us a good little bit of that with the child, or the baby Yoda, on this last episode, because they kind of touched on it. But visualization is so many different things that helps you to kind of see and craft and put the world together. But I do feel like we're going to see more of that, really beautiful sort of like key art that they show us at the end of the episodes, that kind of show us kind of how they kind of put together the visual for the world, and how they kind of saw it coming together. But I think that we might see some rough storyboards. I think we'll definitely see some animatics. And I do think that we're going to see hopefully some design stuff. And I really hope they'll spend a little bit of time on the Mandalorian. I want to know specifically what they were looking at, in the world of Star Wars, but also outside of the world of Star Wars too, because they have talked a lot about westerns, kind of here and there, and I do feel a little Clint Eastwood from The Good and the Bad and the Ugly, with the poncho kind of thing, with the Mandalorian's cape and everything. So I'm very curious to see what they kind of show us, and how they kind of pulled some of his design elements together, because I think the Mandalorian's design is really cool too. So because he's Fett, but he's just not Boba Fett. That's the thing that's kind of neat. He's got those elements, but very clearly they were looking to craft something different. So I'm very curious to see. Hopefully they'll get into that in the next episode. So I think that'd be fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the concept art is a lot of fun. We have some comments here. Jane was saying, yes, adults like Baby Yoda. I just got one for my birthday, which I didn't even know there were any Baby Yoda stuff that was available. Last I heard, I thought that's a lot of that stuff was being delayed. So you're very lucky, because I want a Baby Yoda myself, and I don't have one. Man, I'd love to have one of those puppets, like an authentic, almost screen accurate puppet would be so cool. And then Anthony says, am I the only one who expects to see the child / Baby Yoda in a Star Wars film taking place 50 to 100 years in the future? I hope for him to become the second Mandalorian Jedi Knight wielding the Darksaber. Now that's an interesting idea, and I for one am not exactly sure what the plan is for Baby Yoda, but I have my own theory. And I have touched on my theory, which I would say, unfortunately, ties into what was the last Disney Wars film? I don't even care about their names anymore.
The Rise of Skywalker.
Yeah, well, the Rise of Skywalker, obviously, they brought the Emperor back. So my theory is that Baby Yoda is integral to that process. That they're going to use him. I use the analogy of like a battery. Like he's going to be some sort of force battery to basically bring the Emperor back. And that's heavily implied in the dialogue from Moff Gideon, where Moff Gideon talks about how this child is more valuable to him than the Mandalorian could possibly know. And to me, it just seems kind of obvious that that's what the Baby Yoda's significance is, that he's going to be used somehow to resurrect the Emperor. Now, your scenario, Anthony, I think would be awesome. I think that would be great if they did something like that. And who knows? They could change. They could decide. For instance, they could have been thinking what I'm saying, and then decide, you know what? Screw that. Baby Yoda is so freaking popular. We're just going to go in a totally different direction. I do have a news item that's related to what you're talking about, though, Anthony. Not specifically with Yoda, but it is related to your theory. There's some speculation out there that kind of goes along the lines of what you're talking about, and I'll bring that up during our pop culture news segment, because I do have a story about that, about some speculation about season 3 of The Mandalorian, because we've heard a lot about season 2 already, and it seems like there's going to be just tons and tons and tons of characters from Clone Wars and things like that that are going to be popping up. But there is some speculation out there about season 3 and the direction of where the character, the Mandalorian, might be going. And it's very much what you're talking about. So stay tuned for that, Anthony, because I think you'll be interested in that. But I like your idea. And I do think it's absolutely possible because of the popularity of the character. You know what I mean? Just because the character is so popular, it resonates so much with people. It almost seems like a no-brainer to do something like that, to put him in a movie. But we'll have to see, because they don't always take the obvious path. I mean, we all know that they didn't put Luke and Han together. I thought that was like a no-brainer. Didn't happen. Never got to see Luke and Han together again in Disney Wars films. So they don't always take the obvious path when it comes to Disney and Lucasfilm right now. So your guess is as good as mine, right?
Yeah, I would have to say I think that whatever might have been maybe the original idea for what to do with the child. I wouldn't be surprised if some of that has changed when they see, sort of the pop culture connection that the child has made of Baby Yoda with Star Wars fans of all kinds, whether old or new fans. I think the child is such a beloved character at this point. I can't imagine that they're going to do to him what they. I mean, that might have been the Empire's plan, and that might be what the Empire intends to do this whole time. But I don't think the Baby Yoda will spend much time in some kind of weird booth being drained like a battery, because the character's too beloved for that now. That's just my opinion. They could prove me wrong. I mean, look at some of the stuff they did with Star Trek. I never thought they'd do, but I have faith in what Filoni and Favreau are doing. That I think that they're such big Star Wars fans, and they see that they've created this amazing character that's caught on with people. I think that they're going to continue to find a way to move forward and just tell interesting stories. Because most of the Mandalorian episodes are episodic, even though there's an overarching theme. You know what I mean? They are kind of episodic adventures. So they're kind of bucking the system in terms of what everybody believes to be the end thing. With a lot
Right.
of the streaming shows anyway. So I have a lot of faith in what they're going to do. The fact that Favreau, like you said, Eric, considers himself to be part of the holiday special / the Ewok adventures kind of thing. That's kind of cool because that means he's, I think, some ways more interested in telling stories and just entertaining people, than maybe necessarily trying to connect all the dots. And I think that's what the Mandalorian needs to do, is just continue to take us further into their corner of the world of Star Wars and just continue to take us along on the adventure and just keep us entertained. And let's have some fun. And let's not worry about trying to connect all the dots, in my personal opinion. So
Yeah, it's kind of anybody's guess. And like I said, there are all sorts of rumors about a power struggle going on in Lucasfilm because I'll just put it right out there. I do not like what Kathleen Kennedy has done at Lucasfilm. I think her tenure has been an absolute disaster, with the exception of Rogue One, which I think is actually an excellent film. I really enjoy that. I put that in the top tier of all Star Wars. I really enjoy that film. But I think that was really the director. And I think that's the case also with The Mandalorian. It's Favreau, it's the director, it's his vision, the fact that he has some actual real creativity. And you can see that in this special. You can see that Favreau really knows his stuff. And so this is a guy I think that really kind of sticks to his guns and comes in with the vision. And I can only assume that unlike some of the other directors who have been fired or kind of pushed to the side or all those different kinds of issues that have happened, I think he's got enough juice because of all the work that he's done previously. It's got him to that point where he was hired and they said, you do what you want to do. You know what I mean? Whatever she says, you just do what you want to do because that's why we hired you. We hired you to do this show and we have confidence in you. And that's kind of the vibe that I get, that he really is the one running the show. Because again, with that body language, when they have that round table and Kathleen Kent, and it's a round table, it is a round table, but the way the camera is set up, who's at the head of that table, and it's not Kathleen Kennedy, it's Favreau. He's the one who runs the dialogue. He's running the show. You know what I mean? Literally, when he's talking, she's off to the side, and he's the one talking. He's the one engaging people. He's the one bringing up points. He's the one asking questions. You know what I mean? So I just think that's very telling of his style and how he fits in with this particular show. And again, he mentions that this is like his little corner, very much like the holiday special was its own little thing, very much as the Ewok specials were their little thing. He's like, well, this is my little thing now. You know what I mean? This is my little thing. I'm not part of the big pictures, the big movies and stuff like that. I'm just doing my little show. You know what I mean? Hope you like it, that kind of a thing.
No, yeah,